An older black woman, dressed in simple clothes, stepped into the first-class cabin, only to be met with disdain and subtle mockery from the flight crew. The attendants, full of arrogance and unconscious bias, had no idea who she really was. The woman they tried to humiliate was the biological mother of the airline's powerful owner, a secret that would soon turn their world upside down. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She wore a plain navy tracksuit, a faded sweatshirt, and slightly worn-out pants. A well-used backpack rested on her shoulder, and around her wrist was a thin silver bracelet, a cherished keepsake from her late husband, worn every day for decades. Her eyes were calm yet steady, her steps unhurried, seemingly unaffected by the chaos of the terminal. No one in the bustling Roosevelt International Airport noticed that this quiet, unassuming woman was the mother of Julian Carter, a self-made tech billionaire and the powerful black CEO of Skyward Air, one of the most elite airlines in the country. Evelyn had always chosen a modest private life. She never once sought fame or recognition, even when Julian begged her to appear by his side at press conferences or public galas. For Evelyn, a peaceful and simple life meant far more than flashing lights or fortune. As she approached a small cafe nestled near the boarding gates, she ordered a plain black coffee. The young barista smiled and asked, "Where are you headed today, ma'am?" "To Halbridge," Evelyn replied softly, her voice gentle and warm. "It's a special place. My husband and I spent the most beautiful years of our life there." A tender smile crossed her face, tinged with memory. In that instant, the past came rushing back, the long walks, shared laughter, and quiet evenings with the man she loved. After thanking the barista, Evelyn made her way toward Gate 42B, where Skyward Air's Flight 976 to Halbridge was preparing to board. The airline belonged to her son Julian, though no one there would have guessed it. She waited quietly with the other passengers, her identity and status invisible beneath her modest exterior. When the boarding announcement for first class echoed through the terminal, Evelyn walked calmly to the front of the line. Her composed demeanor didn't change, even under the curious and judging glances of nearby passengers, many likely wondering what a plainly dressed black woman was doing among designer suits and luxury handbags. She gave them a soft, courteous smile, unaware that her choice of simplicity today would spark a chain of events that would ripple far beyond this flight. The morning sun spilled gently onto the polished floor as Evelyn boarded the aircraft. The first-class cabin was a portrait of wealth, wide leather seats, polished fixtures, and a subtle fragrance of expensive cologne in the air. Evelyn glanced at her e-ticket and made her way to seat 2A, a window seat near the front. But no sooner had she sat down than she felt a strange tension. She looked up and met the stare of a white flight attendant standing nearby. Her name was Madison, and Evelyn immediately recognized the look on her face. Suspicion mixed with discomfort, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." Madison's eyes scanned Evelyn's worn clothes with quiet judgment, her face polite but tight. Behind her, a male flight attendant named Bryce approached. He was tall, well-groomed, and wore a carefully practiced smile that vanished the moment he saw Evelyn. "Are you sure she's in the right seat?" Bryce murmured to Madison, just loud enough for Evelyn to catch the edge of his doubt. "Might want to double-check." Madison nodded slightly, her voice low. "I mean, there's no way someone like her booked a first-class seat." Their quiet exchange reached the ears of Camille, the lead first-class attendant. With her sharply styled hair, high-end uniform, and commanding presence, Camille prided herself on knowing at a glance who the elite passengers were. But today, Evelyn didn't fit her idea of who belonged here. Camille narrowed her eyes and spoke to Madison with a cold undertone. "Check her name. I don't want any confusion before takeoff." Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly by the window. She pulled a worn novel from her backpack, flipping to a familiar page in hopes of calming her nerves. But no matter how hard she tried to lose herself in the words, she could feel the pressure of their stares. She knew this feeling well, the quiet sting of judgment and the sting of subtle discrimination, wrapped in professional politeness. And deep down, Evelyn could sense it. This flight would be anything but ordinary. Bryce stood nearby, pretending to review the passenger manifest on his digital tablet. Every so often, he cast another suspicious glance at Evelyn, then leaned in to whisper something to Madison. Both of them chuckled softly, their expressions tinged with smugness, laughter laced with judgment, not amusement. To them, it felt absurd that a black woman dressed plainly could possibly belong in first class. Someone like her, in this cabin? Meanwhile, Camille, the lead attendant, remained silent, her eyes never leaving Evelyn. She studied every small movement, from the way Evelyn folded her hands to how calmly she sat by the window, as if she had every right to be there. And that, for Camille, was the most unsettling part. She had always believed luxury was a privilege reserved for a certain kind of person. Seeing Evelyn, with her modest clothes and quiet dignity, occupying that space so naturally made something stir within her. Not empathy, but discomfort. The tension in the cabin thickened. The once airily elegant first-class space now felt dense and heavy. No one said a word, but some of the other passengers began noticing the strange shift in the crew's behavior, the cold glances, the quiet whispers. And still, Evelyn sat composed, her eyes fixed out the window, as if reminding herself, and everyone else, that she belonged. But deep down, a quiet anxiety churned in her chest. This wasn't new. She had lived through this feeling before. The silent disbelief, the subtle exclusion. She had sensed it coming, and it was about to arrive. From the back of the cabin, Bryce stepped forward, trying to mask his judgment behind a falsely polite smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone polite on the surface, but laced with condescension. "Would you mind if I checked your boarding pass again?" Evelyn slowly looked up, her expression steady and calm. Her eyes filled with quiet strength, the strength of someone who had faced this kind of challenge many times before. She knew this wasn't about security or procedure. Still, without a word, she opened her phone and held up her boarding pass. "Of course," she replied gently. "This is seat 2A, right here." Bryce stared at the screen longer than necessary, then furrowed his brows. "Are you sure this is correct?" he asked, his tone doubtful. "It might have been a system error. Or maybe you were upgraded by mistake." Evelyn inhaled slowly, keeping her tone calm but firm. "I'm absolutely certain," she said. "I purchased this ticket myself, and I received confirmation. There's no mistake." Just then, Camille approached. Her steps were deliberate, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I don't mean to cause trouble, ma'am," she said, though her eyes said otherwise. "But this is first class. It's generally reserved for certain guests. Are you quite sure this is your seat? Our passengers don't usually dress so casually." Her words sliced through the cabin like a cold wind, spoken softly, yet aimed directly at Evelyn's dignity. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked away in discomfort. Others watched with mild curiosity or silent sympathy. Evelyn sat tall in her seat, her hands resting gently in her lap. Years of strength, of grace under pressure, had prepared her for this moment. She looked up at Camille, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with unshakable conviction. "I know exactly where I'm seated. I paid for this ticket like anyone else, and I have just as much right to be here." For a brief moment, Camille was caught off guard. She hadn't expected this quiet woman to speak with such authority, but her pride recovered quickly. Her tone sharpened. "I just want to make sure there's no confusion," Camille said, her gaze growing colder. "It's not every day we see someone who looks out of place in this section. You must understand why we'd have concerns." Evelyn paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her silence now making Camille visibly uncomfortable. Then, with all the clarity and strength her life had taught her, Evelyn responded, "The real confusion here isn't about my seat. It's about your judgment. You're not questioning me because of a ticketing error. You're doing it because of how I look, because of my clothes, because of my skin." Her words hung in the air, undeniable and clear. Bryce and Camille froze, their expressions tight. Behind them, a few passengers whispered. One or two looked away. A few others met Evelyn's gaze with silent support. Camille faltered, then quickly regained her usual icy composure. "I'm sorry," she said curtly, "but unless you can provide further identification, we'll have to ask you to vacate the seat while we verify the information." Evelyn took a deep breath. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it now. "I will not move," she said. "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. I expect you to respect that." The silence in the first-class cabin grew heavier. The crew exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't expected this. They had expected her to shrink back, to apologize, to move. But Evelyn, this quiet, dignified woman, was not going anywhere. And what none of them yet knew was that their entire world was about to change. No one in the cabin could have imagined that Evelyn Carter, quiet, elderly, and modestly dressed, was the mother of Julian Carter, the billionaire CEO who owned Skyward Air. And no one expected her to be so unshakable. Her words struck the cabin like thunder, silencing every whisper, freezing every movement. The tension hung in the air like a held breath. Camille, who had assumed Evelyn would fold under pressure, now stood stunned. Her eyes flickered with discomfort and disbelief. She had misjudged her, badly. But Camille didn't let the silence linger for long. She stepped forward again, her voice composed but layered with cold condescension. "If you're so certain this is your seat," she said sharply, "then I must kindly ask you to provide identification, again, so we can verify. It's standard protocol in cases like this." She stressed the word standard protocol as though they were law, but her tone was clear. This wasn't about procedure. It was about putting Evelyn in her place. Evelyn looked straight at Camille, her eyes no longer soft, but filled with a steady mix of disappointment and restrained fury. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about a boarding pass. It wasn't about a glitch. It was about her skin, her clothes, her existence in a space others felt she didn't belong. "I've already shown you my boarding pass, twice," Evelyn said calmly. "And yet, I see that you haven't asked anyone else to show their ID, so I'll ask you plainly. Why am I the only one being asked to prove myself? Is it because I don't look like your typical passenger?" Her voice was clear, sharp, impossible to misinterpret. Camille paused. The words hung heavily in the air, slicing through the carefully curated luxury of the cabin. Several passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked at Evelyn with newfound empathy. Others quickly looked away, not wanting to be caught in the middle. The worst of them stared blankly, detached and indifferent. Feeling the growing attention, Camille straightened, her voice losing its feigned warmth. "Ma'am," she said curtly, "this is a professional request. It has nothing to do with appearance. But if you refuse to cooperate, we are authorized to ask you to vacate the seat. This is part of my responsibility." Beside her, Bryce gave a subtle nod of agreement, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as though this were entertainment rather than humiliation. Across the aisle, Madison's expression hardened, her eyes filled with disdain, watching Evelyn like a problem rather than a person. The cabin had reached its peak tension. Low murmurs began to stir again among the passengers, some disturbed, some whispering uncomfortable acknowledgments of the obvious bias unfolding before them. But no one spoke up. No one defended Evelyn. And that silence, Evelyn realized, hurt more than Camille's words. It was a familiar pain, the pain of being surrounded by people who see the injustice, but choose comfort over courage. Still, she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not for anyone. She turned once more to Camille, her voice rising. Not in anger, but in truth, clear and resounding enough for everyone to hear. I will not present identification just to prove something you already know. I have followed every procedure, presented a valid boarding pass, and done what any paying passenger should. Asking me, and only me, for more, that's not about security. That's about discrimination and prejudice. The entire cabin fell dead silent. Camille's jaw tightened. Bryce looked away, his smirk gone. Madison froze. Those two words, discrimination and prejudice, had pierced the wall they'd tried to hide behind. Their procedure no longer looked neutral. It looked cruel. It was cruel. Still, Camille clung to her icy professionalism, ignoring Evelyn's accusation as though she hadn't spoken at all. She leaned toward Bryce and muttered, "If she won't comply, call the ground crew. Prepare for escalation." Bryce nodded and quickly turned down the aisle, leaving Evelyn behind in the storm of cold stares and hushed judgment. She sat up straighter, doing everything she could to hold on to her composure, even as something inside her broke. None of the passengers knew who she was. None of them realized they were watching the mother of the man who owned the very airline they were flying on, and none of them understood that their silence would soon become the center of a storm. Evelyn turned her gaze toward the window, holding back the burn in her chest. The shame, the fury, the deep, aching injustice. But she wasn't done. This wasn't the end of her story. Staring out the window, Evelyn Carter vowed silently that she would never forget this moment. Not just for herself, but for the thousands like her who faced invisible, daily humiliations for simply existing in places where others thought they didn't belong. And she knew in her heart, the time had come for everything to change. Permanently. Just as she was trying to steady her breathing and push down the ache rising in her chest, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the aisle of the first-class cabin. Bryce returned, this time with a uniformed security officer in tow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cold, expressionless face trained to respond to emergencies. Not dignity. He barely looked at Evelyn, and when he did, it was with detached indifference, as if assessing a threat instead of seeing a woman. Bryce leaned toward Camille, speaking just loud enough for Evelyn to hear, a deliberate act of cruelty masked as procedure. "I've notified the ground crew," he said. "If she doesn't comply, we're within our rights to remove her from first class." Camille nodded slowly, a grim line settling across her face. Her eyes slid back to Evelyn with a thin veil of smugness, the kind that said, "I've won." Her power over this space was reaffirmed. She stepped forward, positioning herself directly in front of Evelyn, like a judge delivering a verdict. Her voice was devoid of warmth now. Only cold formality remained. "Ma'am, I've tried to handle this respectfully," she said. "But since you refuse to provide identification, we'll have to ask you to vacate your seat and move to a more suitable location. We can't risk further disruption." Evelyn looked up, locking eyes with Camille. Her heart was a storm of fury and heartbreak. Not for herself alone, but for everything this moment represented. She knew this wasn't about rules. Not truly. This was about perception. This was about how a black woman, dressed modestly, had disturbed the illusion of wealth that Camille and her crew guarded so fiercely. But Evelyn also knew something else. That pushing back any further might create chaos, inconvenience others, and allow them to paint her as the problem, the villain. She glanced briefly at the other passengers. Some stared back with vague sympathy, but most avoided her eyes, their silence speaking volumes. No one was going to stand with her. And that lonely truth, it stung even more deeply than Camille's arrogance. After what felt like an eternity, Evelyn stood slowly, her hands trembling ever so slightly, but her spine perfectly straight. Every step away from that seat, the one she had paid for, felt like a cut to her soul. She turned, her voice low yet unshakably clear, echoing through the silent cabin, so that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. "I'm leaving, not because I'm wrong, but because I will not allow this moment to disturb the peace of this flight. But mark my words, this is not the end of my story. I will return, and when I do, it will be for justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel unworthy simply for being who they are." Camille's expression flickered for a moment, shaken by the power of Evelyn's words. But she quickly covered it up and stepped aside, as if to formally eject her from the world of the privileged. The security officer followed just behind Evelyn, with Bryce trailing a few paces back, as if they were escorting a dangerous intruder instead of a dignified woman wrongfully humiliated. As Evelyn made her way down the aisle, she passed seat after seat, each occupied by faces that mostly turned away, some with discomfort, some with pity, but many with the kind of cold detachment that hurt the most. They wouldn't meet her eyes. To them, she was a disturbance, a moment they'd rather forget. She felt the shame press down on her chest, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the world around her had decided that she didn't belong, all because of her skin, her age, her clothing, her existence. But she held her head high, refusing to let the weight of their judgment crush her spirit. With every step, she whispered silently to herself, "This will fuel me. This pain will become fire. I will not be silent." As she reached the partition between first class and economy, Evelyn turned back. She looked at Camille, at Bryce. One final glance. Fierce, unshaken, steeped in something deeper than anger. Truth. "You'll understand one day," she said, "that a person's worth is not determined by their skin, or their clothes, or how quietly they sit. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this moment, and what you did." Camille blinked, briefly rattled. Bryce looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Evelyn said no more. She turned and walked into the economy cabin, leaving behind not just a seat, but a system that had long refused to see her. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Discrimination and indifference had claimed a temporary victory. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in a cramped seat near the back of the economy cabin, the humiliation still raw. But deep within her something powerful stirred, a quiet, burning resolve. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. She wouldn't stay silent. She wouldn't back down. And she wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for every soul who had ever been made to feel small, out of place, or invisible. The plane soared through the white clouds, leaving the city of Roosevelt behind, its skyline fading into the past. Evelyn sat motionless, trying to hold on to whatever calm she could find after what had just happened. Emotions surged beneath the surface: shame, anger, grief. She fought to keep them from spilling over, but she knew she couldn't let those feelings win. Not today. When the plane landed at Halbridge International Airport, Evelyn moved quickly, her steps determined. She pulled out her phone the moment they reached the gate. Her screen lit up with missed calls and unread messages, all from her son, Julian Carter. He already knew. Her heart sank and warmed all at once. She tapped his name and raised the phone to her ear. The moment it connected, Julian's voice cut through, tight, sharp, filled with fury. "Mom, are you all right?" I heard what happened. I can't believe this happened. On my airline." His voice trembled with restrained rage. Evelyn knew her son. Julian was powerful, driven, and fiercely protective, especially when it came to injustice, and when it came to her. She also knew what he was about to do. "I'm fine," she replied gently, her voice like a calming breeze against the storm she heard in his. "But what happened today? It broke something in me. Not just because I was humiliated, but because it proves how deeply rooted this prejudice still is, even in the company you built to stand for something better." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When Julian spoke again, his tone was cold, not toward her, but toward those who had betrayed the values he had worked so hard to instill. "I'm not letting this slide. Camille, Bryce, Madison, they're done. I'm firing them first thing in the morning." Evelyn closed her eyes. She understood his anger. She shared it. But she also knew that rage alone couldn't create lasting change. "Julian," she said softly, but with a quiet command in her voice, "I know you want to do what's right. And I'm angry too. But just removing them won't fix what's broken." He didn't respond at first. "The real issue," she continued, "isn't just with those three people. It's in the culture of your company, in the way people are trained, in the biases they don't even recognize." Julian exhaled, the fire still in his voice, but now tempered by something else. Reflection. "So what do you think I should do? Just let them stay?" Evelyn shook her head, though he couldn't see it. Her voice grew firmer, more certain. "I'm not saying they shouldn't be held accountable," she said. "But if you fire them in anger, people will see it as personal vengeance, not a call for justice. Use this moment. Let it become a turning point. Call an emergency meeting. Show your entire team what's happening beneath the surface. And then, change it. Not just on paper, but in the heart of the company." Her voice didn't waver. Every word she spoke carried the weight of a woman who had seen too much and stayed strong through it all. "You have the power to transform this place. Make it a model of equity, respect, and real inclusion. Do more than punish. Teach, reform, lead." There was a silence again, but this time it wasn't resistance. It was realization. Julian's voice came through again, quieter now, thoughtful. "That means you'll have to stand in front of everyone, the same people who hurt you. Are you ready for that?" A soft smile touched Evelyn's lips. He couldn't see it, but she knew he could feel it. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. "If it means others won't have to endure what I did today, then yes, Julian, I'll stand beside you." Julian's voice trembled, this time not with rage, but with pride and conviction. "Then we'll do it. Tomorrow morning. I'll call everyone in, every manager, every department head, and you'll be there with me. They'll all know that from now on Skyward Air will be different. We will never tolerate discrimination again, not in any form." Evelyn nodded, her heart lighter. The pain still lingered, but now it had purpose, and she knew this was the beginning of something far bigger than a seat on a plane. The pain Evelyn Carter had endured the day before wasn't just a wound, it was a call to action. And now it had opened the door to something far greater, real, lasting change. Not just for her, but for thousands like her. People who had been silenced, judged, and pushed aside for far too long. Now, they would be seen. That very next morning, sunlight streamed through the towering windows of Skyward Air's global headquarters. The golden rays lit up the glass walls of the conference room on the top floor, but even the morning light couldn't lift the weight hanging in the air. Julian Carter stood at the window, staring out at the city below. His jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable, and his thoughts turbulent. He had barely slept the night before. Not out of weakness, but out of resolve. This was a meeting he had never imagined having to call. But now, nothing felt more necessary. The long, polished wood table in the center of the room gleamed under the ceiling lights. The sleek leather chairs, usually a symbol of pride and power, now seemed stiff and cold, like they were awaiting judgment. One by one, senior executives and managers filed in, their faces tense with curiosity and unease. They could feel something was wrong. Different. No one dared speak as they took their seats, waiting for Julian to begin. Then came the last three to enter: Camille, Bryce, and Madison. Their steps were confident, their smiles unbothered. They thought they were being brought in for praise, perhaps recognition for their professional handling of a situation on board. Camille, poised and elegant as always, made her way straight to one of the seats closest to Julian, as if she were the most important person in the room. Bryce and Madison followed, exchanging glances of pride and anticipation. Not one of them suspected the real reason they were there. To them, the incident on Flight 976 the day before had been a standard enforcement of policy, a necessary response to an irregularity. They had no idea that they themselves were the true irregularity, that their arrogance, unconscious bias, and casual cruelty were now center stage. As the heavy doors to the conference room closed, Julian turned slowly from the window. He scanned the room, his sharp gaze making everyone sit a little straighter. A long silence followed. Everyone held their breath, unsure of what was coming. Camille smiled, expecting his praise. Bryce adjusted his collar. Madison smoothed her skirt and crossed her legs with ease. But then Julian spoke, and the temperature in the room dropped. "I didn't call this meeting to offer congratulations," he said, his voice cold and even. "On the contrary, I'm here to address a very serious incident, one that has shaken my trust in the people seated in this room, and forced me to question the culture we've allowed to grow within this company." The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples across the faces around the table. Camille's confident smile faltered. Bryce leaned back slowly, confused. Madison blinked, her posture stiffening. Julian stepped forward, his voice sharper now. Yesterday, on Flight 976 from Roosevelt to Halbridge, an elderly black woman, a paying first-class passenger, was humiliated. She was disrespected, judged, removed from her rightful seat. A stunned hush fell over the room. Julian's eyes locked directly on Camille. "Miss Camille, do you know who the woman you and your team forced out of first class was?" Camille's face froze. A thin bead of sweat formed near her temple. I didn't know," she stammered. "We were just following protocol. We thought there might have been a mistake in the system. We were trying to maintain order." Julian cut her off, his tone slicing through the air like a blade. "Which part of our protocol gives you the right to question someone's presence because of how they look? Which rule allows you to humiliate a passenger because their clothes didn't match your expectations? Because their skin was darker than what you're used to seeing in first class?" Camille sat in stunned silence. Bryce swallowed hard. Madison dropped her gaze, unable to meet Julian's eyes. The room shifted, all eyes now turning toward the three attendants. No one spoke. The shame was palpable. Julian took a breath. His voice was no longer cold. Now it carried the weight of something deeply personal. "The woman you disrespected is my mother, Evelyn Carter." Gas rippled through the room. Camille's face turned a ghostly shade of white. Bryce's jaw dropped. Madison looked as if she might collapse. None of them could speak. Their polished, professional facades had shattered, and Julian, standing tall, calm, and resolute, was just getting started. Julian Carter no longer held back. There was no softness left in his tone, only truth. "I want you all to understand one thing," he said firmly. Skyward Air will never tolerate discrimination in any form. He let that sentence settle in the air before continuing, each word sharpened with conviction. This meeting isn't just about holding a few individuals accountable. It's about facing a much deeper, more painful truth, that prejudice still lives within our company. And if we don't confront it now, with courage and clarity, we are complicit. He paused, his eyes landing on Camille, Bryce, and Madison, the three now sitting pale and frozen in their chairs. I will never allow another passenger to go through what my mother experienced. Starting today, Skyward's culture will change completely, and it starts now. The room fell into a deep, uneasy silence. The senior managers and board members sat motionless, their eyes wide, their expressions stunned. Every glance had now turned to Camille, Bryce, and Madison, who sat like statues, their faces washed in fear and disbelief. It felt like no one dared to breathe. Then quietly, the door to the conference room opened. All eyes turned. Standing in the doorway was Evelyn Carter, dressed just as she had been the day before. The same worn sweatshirt, the same faded pants. And yet, in that moment, she looked regal, unshakable, unapologetically powerful. She stepped in slowly, her presence so commanding that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Camille's eyes widened in horror. Her mouth opened slightly as the blood drained from her face. Bryce's hands gripped each other tightly beneath the table, his once casual posture now rigid with dread. Madison dropped her gaze, visibly trembling, as if trying to vanish from the moment altogether. Julian immediately walked toward his mother, gently guiding her to stand with him at the center of the room. He spoke clearly, his voice rich with pride, sorrow, and a deep sense of justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want you to meet the woman at the heart of everything we've discussed today. This is my mother, Evelyn Carter, the woman whose strength shaped who I am, and the woman your team disrespected, dehumanized, and dismissed yesterday on Flight 976. The room gasped. A wave of whispers rippled around the table. Evelyn stood firm, not needing to speak. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Camille looked as if she might faint. Bryce's eyes darted toward the exit. Madison's shoulders trembled as silent tears began to form. Evelyn raised her head, her voice calm, steady, and piercing. "I'm not here for revenge, and I don't want special treatment." She looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone, especially the three flight crew members. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to others every day. They don't get to speak up. They don't have someone in power who hears their pain. So today, I speak for them." A wave of silence followed. No one dared interrupt. Camille abruptly stood, her voice shaking, her words fumbling out. "Mrs. Carter, I didn't know who you were, I swear. We were just following protocol. I didn't mean—" Evelyn raised her hand gently, stopping Camille mid-sentence with a calm, yet undeniable authority. Her tone remained soft, but her message struck deep. "That's exactly the problem," Evelyn said. "You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I didn't belong." She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Would you have treated a white man in a tailored suit the same way? Would you have asked for his ID 3 times? Would you have laughed about it behind his back?" Camille froze. There was no answer, only guilt. Bryce lowered his eyes. Madison wiped away the tears silently streaming down her cheeks. Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This is what makes unconscious bias so dangerous. It's quiet, it's subtle, but it destroys dignity all the same." She took a deep breath and let the weight of the moment settle across the room. And that is what must change. Not just policies, but mindsets. Not just checklists, but hearts. Evelyn stood tall, her voice unwavering. We must change, not just our policies, but our thinking, how we see each other, how we train our people, how we honor the dignity and diversity of every single individual who steps onto one of our planes. Julian placed a steady hand on his mother's shoulder, his gaze filled with pride and quiet gratitude. Her strength was the foundation of everything he believed in, and today it shone brighter than ever. Picking up where she left off, Julian addressed the room once more, this time with firm, impassioned clarity. Let none of us forget this day, he said. From this moment forward, Skyward Air will commit itself, fully and without compromise, to eliminating all forms of discrimination and prejudice within our organization. We will not be known only for our financial success. We will be known for being a place where every passenger, no matter their background, is treated with respect, with care, and with dignity. Julian's words echoed like a powerful call to awakening. The boardroom remained silent, but the impact was undeniable. Camille, Bryce, and Madison sat frozen. They now understood with chilling clarity. Their lives, their careers, had reached a turning point. They couldn't return to the way things were, and they couldn't hide anymore. Evelyn's presence had turned a page, not just in their story, but in the future of Skyward Air. It was a page marked by challenge, but also by a rare and necessary hope. The silence lingered until Evelyn took a step forward once more. Though small in stature, she now stood at the center of the room like a giant, her eyes sharp, her voice low but powerful, resonating with the calm strength of someone who had endured and survived storms far greater than this. She turned to the three attendants, who sat like statues in their chairs, weighed down by shame. Camille was the first to find her voice, though it trembled with every syllable. "Mrs. Carter," she stammered, "I truly apologize. We didn't mean to discriminate. We were just following protocol." Evelyn gently raised her hand, silencing Camille with grace, not anger. She locked eyes with her. "Miss Camille," she said evenly, "let me ask you one question." Her voice was steady, the words deliberate. "In all your years of service, have you ever asked a white passenger, dressed as simply as I was, to show ID after already presenting a valid first-class ticket?" Camille faltered. Her mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. Nothing she could say would suffice. Evelyn didn't need a response. Her eyes remained fixed on Camille as she continued. "Before and after I boarded that plane, I saw at least 3 white passengers dressed in outfits just as modest as mine. None of them were questioned. None of them were doubted." She turned her attention to Bryce, who tried to speak. "Mrs. Carter, we didn't mean to offend you. It was just, there was some confusion with the seating system. I admit we could have handled it better, but I swear it wasn't about race." Before he could finish, Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a thin stack of papers, records she had spent the entire night compiling. She placed them on the table, her tone firm. "I did my homework," she said. "I reviewed passenger incident reports from the last 3 months. Of the 27 passengers who were questioned, delayed, or forced to leave their seats despite holding valid tickets, 23 were black or from other minority groups." The room went completely still. Gasps and hushed murmurs moved like a wave. Executives exchanged glances of disbelief and guilt. Evelyn went on, her voice now crystal clear. "There is no policy in Skyward Air's manual that allows ID checks based on someone's outfit or appearance. So I ask again, Camille, Bryce, Madison, what was it that led you to question me? Was it truly my clothing? Or was it the color of my skin?" No one could answer. Bryce's face was flushed and tense. Madison was now openly crying. Camille seemed to shrink into herself, speechless. Evelyn's voice sharpened, like the edge of truth cutting through excuses. "You didn't question me because I looked suspicious. You questioned me because I didn't fit your mental picture of who belongs in first class. Camille tried once more, her voice weak, desperate. I'm sorry. I didn't think that deeply. I honestly didn't. Evelyn interrupted, her tone stern but calm. And that is exactly the problem. You didn't think. You acted on instinct, on bias, and you didn't even realize the harm you were causing. That's what makes racism so dangerous. It isn't always loud. It isn't always hateful. Sometimes it's quiet, unconscious, and devastating. The room was silent again. Not out of fear, but out of reckoning. Evelyn's voice softened, but still carried the same strength. This time, not as a critic, but as a teacher. I'm not standing here to destroy anyone. I just want us all to look honestly at ourselves. Prejudice isn't always deliberate, but if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't face it, it will continue to grow, and more people will suffer. Julian Carter placed his hand gently on his mother's shoulder, his eyes filled with admiration and immeasurable gratitude. Then, turning back to the boardroom, his voice deepened, not with anger, but with purpose. From this moment forward, he said, we must do more than recognize what went wrong yesterday. We must act. Skyward Air will launch a comprehensive anti-discrimination and racial equity training program for all employees, and I mean everyone, from top-level executives to entry-level staff. Effective today. He paused. We will no longer tolerate any behavior that contradicts the values we claim to stand for. A heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of Julian and Evelyn's words settled into every corner, into every heart. Camille, Bryce, and Madison sat still, now fully grasping the gravity of what they'd been part of. Not just a mistake, but a culture that had silently permitted discrimination to fester beneath polished professionalism. Everyone in the room knew. There was no going back. Only forward, and only through accountability. Evelyn stepped forward again. Her presence was calm yet resolute. In her hands was a thick stack of papers, the same she had compiled the night before. She laid them gently on the center of the table, her fingers brushing over them like someone holding fragile truths. These are not just numbers, she said. These are people, stories, pain. Her voice was slow, deliberate, clear. What you see here are not isolated cases. This is the evidence of a system that has quietly allowed prejudice to hide behind procedure. She began turning the pages. Each sheet revealed more. Statistics, internal emails, patterns. Every turn felt like a drumbeat of truth, impossible to ignore. In just the last 3 months, she continued, I've documented 27 cases where passengers were questioned, delayed, or removed from their seats, despite having valid tickets. Out of those, 23 were Black or members of other minority communities. The room stiffened. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes averted. Evelyn paused. Her sharp gaze swept across the table, stopping on those who couldn't meet it. Then, from the far end of the room, a trembling voice spoke. It was William Hawthorne, one of the longest-serving board members. Mrs. Carter, he said weakly, I'm sure those were just isolated lapses in judgment. Skyward Air has always tried to treat its passengers fairly. Evelyn didn't let him finish. Mr. Hawthorne, she said, her voice now as sharp as steel, that's exactly the problem. You think these are accidents. You think bias only exists when it's loud and obvious. But the truth is, the most dangerous prejudice is the one we don't acknowledge, the one we excuse as oversight or protocol or just doing our job. Her eyes locked onto his. You and others in leadership allowed a culture of quiet exclusion to take root and grow unchecked. Evelyn flipped another page, revealing a highlighted report. "This is Jamal Thompson," she said, "a young black entrepreneur who was escorted off a business class seat last month due to a system glitch." But what really happened? A flight attendant assumed he couldn't possibly belong in that seat. She held up another page. "This is Rosa Mendoza, a Latina woman, top-tier Skyward member. She was made to wait over 40 minutes while white passengers were welcomed and assisted. Her ID was questioned. Her loyalty was doubted. Her voice grew firmer, clearer with each example. These aren't glitches. These are patterns, and we've been hiding them under the rug, calling them misunderstandings or technical errors." The board sat still, heads lowered. Some covered their mouths. Others stared at the floor, shame creeping into their expressions. Even Hawthorne, who had tried to speak earlier, now sat in humbled silence, his face flushed. Evelyn turned toward Camille, Bryce, and Madison once more. But this time, without contempt, only truth. "You see now," she said softly, "this was never just about the three of you. You were acting within a broken system, one you didn't even realize was broken. But now that you do know, what you choose to do next will define you." She looked back to Julian, then to the board. Her voice, still steady, carried a weight no one could escape. Real change doesn't begin with slogans or punishment. It begins when we look in the mirror and refuse to look away. Evelyn Carter's voice softened now, but it didn't lose its edge, the kind of strength born not from anger, but from truth. "I believe none of you want to keep working in a world where unconscious bias shapes how people are treated, especially not in your own workplace," she said, looking into the eyes of every board member. "But change doesn't come from silence or comfort. It comes from truth, and the courage to confront it head on." She let her gaze settle for a moment, then added, "I hope that from this day forward, Skyward Air will stop chasing only profit and image and start honoring the human dignity and social responsibility we all bear." Julian stepped beside his mother, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. His eyes carried a new fire, not just pride, but purpose. "My mother is right," he said firmly. "From this day forward, Skyward Air will undergo a complete and permanent transformation." His words rang out through the room. "We will retrain from the ground up. We will rewire our policies and our people. And we will make sure that no passenger ever experiences what my mother did again." The energy in the boardroom shifted. This wasn't just a policy announcement. This was a reckoning and a promise. Everyone in the room understood. They weren't attending just another company meeting. They were standing at the edge of a new beginning, a future where fairness, equity, and dignity wouldn't just be ideals printed in brochures. They would become lived values. Julian's voice filled the room again. Steady, commanding. "We cannot move forward by pretending these issues are isolated. My mother's experience is not an exception. It is a symptom of a deeper sickness in our culture." He paused, letting the words sink into every corner of the room. "What she endured is a direct contradiction to everything I've built this company to stand for." He stepped forward again, his tone resolute. "That's why, starting now, we are launching the largest and most comprehensive reform Skyward Air has ever seen. Not just in how we manage operations, but in how we shape people. From the executive team to the ground crew," he continued. "Every employee will undergo mandatory training in anti-racism, unconscious bias, and social responsibility." He looked across the room. "And I don't want a symbolic checklist. I want transformation. We will partner with top human rights and equity experts to build a training program that works, not just one that looks good." Then he turned his attention to Camille, Bryce, and Madison, who sat quietly in their seats, visibly changed, humbled, uncertain. Julian's tone grew firmer, but remained just. "As for you three, the ones directly responsible for what happened. He paused. I have every right to terminate your employment. But I won't. Not yet. Instead, he continued, you'll be transferred to the Customer Experience Division. You will serve exclusively in economy class for the next 3 months. His gaze didn't waver. I want you to see the passengers you once overlooked. I want you to understand, deeply, what it means to serve every person with equal respect, regardless of how they look or dress. Camille lowered her head, her cheeks flushed with a mix of shame and unexpected relief. Bryce and Madison both nodded silently, no longer carrying even a shadow of their previous arrogance. This wasn't punishment. It was education. The kind that changed lives. Julian stepped forward again, now speaking to the entire board with renewed strength. And that's just the beginning. I am instructing our Human Resources Department to immediately begin rewriting our personnel evaluation systems. From now on, performance reviews will not be based solely on productivity or customer ratings. He looked at the HR director seated near the end of the table. We will now include criteria that evaluate an employee's commitment to equity, inclusivity, and ethical behavior. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The boardroom sat in total silence, not out of fear, but from clarity. They understood now. This wasn't just a public relations move. It was a moral shift, one rooted in responsibility. And these values, diversity and anti-discrimination, must now be at the core of everything we do. Julian Carter's final words echoed through the boardroom like a mission statement etched in stone. This isn't something we can take lightly anymore, he added. Skyward Air must become a living symbol of respect and equality for every passenger, regardless of background, appearance, or heritage. The entire board nodded in unison. Some leaned forward to scribble notes as if trying to capture every word, but most simply sat in awe, fully aware that this moment marked the beginning of something far greater than corporate reform. Julian continued, his tone sincere and unwavering. I know this won't be easy, but this change is not just about public image. It's about doing the right thing for people, for society, and for the dignity of every human being. He looked around the room, locking eyes with each person. I believe every single one of you has the ability and the responsibility to lead this change. When Julian finished speaking, the silence that followed wasn't awkward or forced. It was profound, because everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic, not just a meeting, but a turning point in Skyward Air's story. And Evelyn, standing proudly by her son, knew deep in her heart. This wasn't just the best way to address the past. It was the right way forward. 3 months later, the season had shifted. Summer's warmth had softened into autumn's golden glow. On a new flight with Skyward Air, Evelyn Carter sat quietly by the window in first class. Everything looked familiar, the sky, the seats, even the soft buzz of conversation around her. But the atmosphere felt different. This time, it was peaceful, respectful, hopeful. The changes Julian had fought for weren't just theoretical. Evelyn could feel them in the way the staff moved, spoke, and treated every passenger. Something real was blooming. Still, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the past. The pain, the humiliation, and the quiet moments when she had almost walked away. But her heart also carried curiosity about the real changes, about the people who had once hurt her. Then a gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Carter, may I have a moment of your time? Evelyn looked up. It was Bryce. Gone was the smug, dismissive expression she remembered. In its place was a quiet humility. His shoulders seemed lighter, not from pride, but from growth. He looked nervous, his hands clasped together tightly. Evelyn offered a calm, welcoming smile. Of course, Bryce. He sat beside her, visibly struggling to contain the emotion that bubbled beneath his composed exterior. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to offer you a sincere apology, not just for that day on the plane, but for how I treated you and how I saw you. I didn't just make a mistake. I made a choice based on prejudice I didn't even know I had." Evelyn said nothing. She simply listened. Bryce went on, his voice softer now, as though each word came from somewhere deep and raw. "When I was reassigned to economy class these past 3 months, I hated it at first. I felt insulted. But soon I realized that the discomfort I felt was nothing compared to what others had endured for years." He paused. "I used to think I was above it all, like I could decide who deserved respect. But the truth is, I was blind. Until one day, a passenger, an older black gentleman, looked me in the eyes and asked me, 'Have you ever put yourself in someone else's shoes?'" Bryce stopped. His eyes watered. "That question shook me, Mrs. Carter, because I hadn't. Not once." Evelyn's gaze softened. She could see the sincerity, the discomfort, the growth. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she waited. And Bryce continued. "I've thought about you every single day since that flight," he said, his voice steady now. "No apology will ever fully erase what I did, or the pain I caused you. But I want you to know I've changed, truly, and not just because I had to, but because I wanted to." "I've recognized my own unconscious biases," Bryce said, his voice firm but filled with humility, "and I'm determined never to let those thoughts control me again." Evelyn gently reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of profound forgiveness. Her voice was soft, emotional, but steady. "Bryce," she said, "I never wanted anyone to carry the pain I've lived with. But sometimes, only when we are placed in someone else's shoes, do we finally learn the value of empathy." She gave him a quiet nod of affirmation. "These last 3 months, they were your lesson, and I hope you'll carry those lessons with you, not just for yourself, but to help others grow too." Bryce nodded, eyes glistening. There was no more arrogance, no more defensiveness, only sincerity and resolve. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'll never forget this conversation, and from this day forward, I'll use everything I've learned to fight against bias, not only in myself, but in those around me." Evelyn smiled. It was faint, but it carried the warmth of hope, because she knew this wasn't just a moment of closure. It was a moment of transformation. This honest exchange between a woman once humiliated and a man once blind to his own prejudice symbolized something greater. Not just personal healing, but the living, breathing proof that real change had begun within Skyward Air. The company's shift wasn't just in manuals, training sessions, or policy handbooks. It was in actions, in attitudes, in people. 6 months after Evelyn Carter stood at that historic boardroom meeting, Skyward Air had become a case study in transformation. The media, civil rights groups, and even corporate competitors took notice. What shocked many wasn't just Skyward's bold promises. It was the concrete, transparent actions they had taken to eliminate unconscious bias and promote equity within their culture. Where once Skyward was seen as a high-end airline catering to the elite, its name now carried something deeper, a humanitarian reputation rooted in fairness, equality, and accountability. The story of Evelyn Carter, paired with Julian's courageous reform program, spread quickly. It became one of the most inspiring corporate culture turnarounds in recent memory. As the story gained momentum, other airlines, both across the United States and internationally, reached out to Julian directly. Executives from Skybridge Air, Nova Flight, and Altitude Global asked to study Skyward's transformation model, eager to adapt similar values and procedures in their own organizations. Not long after, an international aviation summit was held in New York City, bringing together leaders from the world's top airlines. There, standing under the spotlight, Julian Carter addressed hundreds of CEOs, executives, and policymakers. He didn't deliver a flashy speech. He spoke with clarity and truth. "Our company made a mistake," Julian said. "A mistake that revealed something deeper. Biases that had been quietly tolerated for far too long." He paused, letting the silence build. "But when we chose to stop hiding, when we owned those mistakes and committed to changing them, that's when we became stronger." Julian's eyes scanned the crowd. "And the most important thing I've learned through this journey is this. If you want to change the world outside your walls, you have to start by confronting the one inside." His words reverberated through the conference hall. Julian's message was not one of shame, but one of possibility. "I hope your companies won't need to go through what we did to start making change," he concluded. "Start now. Because bias and injustice should have no place in any organization, not in the skies and not on the ground." In the months following the Global Aviation Leadership Conference in New York City, airlines around the world began making history. The summit had set a new precedent, urging every airline to address the often ignored issue of systemic discrimination within their operations. What began with Skyward Air's transformation had now become a movement. One of the first airlines to step forward was Nova Flight International. Just a month after the conference, they announced the rollout of mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, inspired directly by the reforms launched by Skyward Air. But what stood out most was their decision to invite a very specific guest speaker. Bryce Whitman, the former first-class flight attendant at Skyward, who had once played a direct role in the discriminatory treatment of Evelyn Carter. Now, he stood not as a man trying to defend his past, but as one who had grown through it. Bryce shared his personal story with raw honesty, how he had unconsciously carried bias, how he had been blind to the small ways he made people feel unwelcome, and how the moment he was forced to confront the pain he caused became the turning point of his life. His message resonated across the room, not because he claimed to be perfect now, but because he showed that real change was possible when pride was set aside and accountability was embraced. That moment, captured on video and widely shared across social media, became a beacon of hope. In less than a year, more than 40 airlines across the U.S. and abroad followed suit, adopting internal reforms modeled after Skyward Air's transformation. Together, they signed a joint declaration now known as the Alliance for Equality and Anti-Racism in Aviation. It was the first time in aviation history that airlines publicly acknowledged that their industry had a responsibility not only to safety and service, but to justice and inclusion. And just like that, a new standard had been set. As part of their initiatives, many airlines began launching media campaigns, spotlighting not just corporate commitments, but human stories. The stories of Evelyn Carter, Bryce Whitman, and the leadership of Julian Carter were shared in panel discussions, training seminars, and national broadcasts. These weren't PR stunts. They were conversation starters, designed to shift the culture within and beyond the airline industry. And they worked. Across industries, from hospitality to tech, companies began reevaluating their practices, revisiting their values, and asking questions they had long ignored. All because one woman chose not to remain silent, and one man chose to listen. The story of Evelyn and Julian Carter was no longer just a personal journey or a company's pivot. It had become a cultural turning point, a reminder that dignity, respect, and fairness are not optional. They are the foundations of trust. Where Skyward Air had once been associated with luxury and exclusivity, it was now seen as a model of corporate integrity and reform, a shining example of what can happen when leadership dares to act not out of damage control, but out of conviction. Months later, Evelyn once again boarded a skyward air flight. She moved down the jet bridge with the same calm grace as before, dressed as she always did, a comfortable sweater, soft slacks, a well-worn bracelet from her late husband still on her wrist. But this time the energy on board felt different. There were no suspicious stares, no hushed whispers, no sideways glances, only warmth, quiet and sincere. Evelyn took her seat in first class and glanced around. Across from her sat a young black entrepreneur reading a stack of reports with focused energy. 2 rows ahead, an elderly Asian couple smiled warmly as they settled in. Further down, a Latina woman in casual jeans leaned against the window, flipping through a paperback novel. All of them were here, diverse, relaxed, and free to just be. This was no longer an exception. It was the new norm. A young flight attendant approached Evelyn with a soft smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us today. Is there anything I can bring you before takeoff?" The voice was respectful, the gaze sincere, not because she knew who Evelyn was, but because she was living the values Skyward now stood for. Evelyn smiled back gently. "Thank you, dear. Just a glass of water would be perfect." The attendant nodded and left. Evelyn turned toward the window. As the engines began to hum, she watched the clouds drift past, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not because the past was forgotten, but because it had mattered. The pain she once carried was no longer a burden. It had become a foundation, a cornerstone for something far bigger than herself. Then her gaze caught something, someone, near the rear of the first-class cabin. It was Bryce. He was helping an older black passenger stow their carry-on overhead. His movements were careful, his expression calm, and his eyes kind. There was no trace of the man he used to be, only sincerity, only growth. Evelyn watched quietly, her heart swelling with something deeper than forgiveness. It was affirmation, proof that the change she had fought for wasn't just surface level. It had reached the hearts of those who once resisted it. Bryce glanced up, as if sensing her gaze. He saw her, and in that instant their eyes met. No words, no gestures, just a small, quiet nod, a mutual recognition, gratitude, respect. It only lasted a second, but in that moment, both of them knew. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a better chapter. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, the gentle hum of the aircraft offering a quiet rhythm to her thoughts. For the first time in a long while, her mind felt still, not because the world had changed overnight, but because she could finally see the impact of her voice, her courage, and the choices that followed. The respect she now received wasn't a privilege handed down from her son, Julian Carter, nor was it an exception made because of her name. This moment, this peace, it was the result of relentless effort from her, from Julian, and from many others who chose to face their blind spots instead of running from them. Those who had once failed were now choosing to walk the hardest road, the path of accountability and transformation. This was the true victory, and Evelyn knew in her soul. It was never hers alone. It belonged to every black passenger who had once sat in silence, enduring sideways glances and whispered doubts. It belonged to the employees who had discovered their own hidden biases and had the courage to change. It belonged to the countless people, named and unnamed, who believed that justice and dignity should never be conditional. And more than anything, it belonged to the future, a future where no one's worth would be questioned because of the shade of their skin or the simplicity of their clothes. A future where respect was the baseline, not a reward. Evelyn glanced around the first-class cabin once more. Passengers of all backgrounds smiled, chatted, or relaxed in peace. There was no tension in the air, No one had to shrink themselves or explain their presence. She saw them, and she saw herself, not as someone out of place, but as someone who had helped build this place anew. The pain she had once endured, that silent, heavy ache from years of being doubted and dismissed, had become the very foundation protecting others now. From this moment forward, she knew no passenger would have to suffer what she once did. That knowledge alone brought her a joy deeper than words, a kind of joy that settles into the bones and soothes the soul. As the plane soared gently through layers of white clouds, Evelyn turned her eyes toward the soft horizon. She felt no bitterness, no lingering anger, only a quiet, resolute peace. Because she understood something profound. This wasn't just her healing, it was a shared healing. The journey she had walked, from silent hurt to bold confrontation, was no longer just hers. It was now a part of a global story, a story told in boardrooms, training rooms, classrooms, and airport terminals around the world. A story reminding everyone that real change is not only possible, it is necessary. With a final deep breath, Evelyn gently closed her eyes. A soft smile formed on her lips. Not because she had been vindicated, not because she was finally seen, but because now she could rest in the knowledge that her fight had meant something, that no one, not a single soul, would have to walk the same painful path alone ever again. This was not just her victory, it was the victory of everyone. Everyone who had been overlooked, everyone who had spoken up, everyone who had listened, everyone who had changed. Evelyn Carter's story was never just the journey of one woman. It was and remains a symbol, a voice for the unheard, a challenge to the status quo, and a blueprint for every institution and leader who dares to ask, what kind of world do we want to build? From a seat denied to a movement ignited, from silent stares to global awareness, from hurt to hope. This story reminds us, true dignity does not come from titles or uniforms. It comes from how we treat one another. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination or subtle prejudice in the sky, at work, or in everyday life? Your story matters. Share it in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation alive. If this story moved you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more human-centered, heart-driven content. Together, let's keep flying toward a future built on empathy, equality, and compassion.